Alexis Ivy, author of Taking the Homeless Census. This is an amazing collection. I've just been like so excited to talk to you about this. In part, it's because the content is so recognizable to me. But I feel like maybe even someone who hasn't been on the streets or struggled with addiction would be reached by these. And the way you are so unafraid of being vulnerable. I mean, I really applaud it. It is scary enough putting down, words on a piece of paper creatively. There's already a sense of vulnerability just in being a writer, but you're taking it to like some really personal spaces. And I just felt like this was these poems were like, they were fragrant and they were sensual. Like I felt the prick of dirty needles reading it. I smelled the, body fluids, and it just was, no holds barred, man. So I just wanted to start off by asking you, how did this collection come about? How long did it take you to write them? Just when did the first seed get planted?
Well, I would say in 2012, I started writing these poems. I just kind of had finally moved out of my parents' house, had been sober for a few years, and just kind of started getting it together. And I had just published my first collection, Romance with Small Time Crooks, and just kind of trying to find my place in the world. Like I had a couple of years sober and like didn't really know where I was going or what I was doing, and I was trying to live on my own and create a home, and also trying to find out, career-wise, like I was going part-time to Harvard Extension and just kind of just trying to figure out what I wanted. I knew that I wanted to work with high-risk individuals, and I always like volunteered or like took some time and helped out at soup kitchens. It's just something I always did, and I felt like, I think inside, even like growing up and through childhood, just that feeling of trying to find a sense of belonging, and always had trouble with that. So I think that homelessness, I always felt a connection to, more so than like other high risk populations. Maybe I hadn't done any jail time, so I didn't feel as connected to working with inmates, even though I do want to work with inmates at some point in time.
Yeah.
But I felt this sense of camaraderie, and I always like, whenever I saw a homeless person, just my whole life, it wasn't about money. It's funny, I used to give a buck or two, and then once I sobered up, I was like, okay, I'm not giving money anymore. I know where most of that money's going to, and it's just not what I'd rather. Just have a conversation, take them out for a meal, and just like make them feel special. And that's always been something that I did. Bum a cigarette, just kind of check in. And I just did that, without getting paid for it for years.
Yeah.
And I was fine with that. I actually, like, it's strange, when I started to work in homeless services, it's not in my hometown. I live in Boston and I'm working in Cambridge and Somerville.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a big transition to be like, okay, I can like help people in Cambridge with like food, water, things like that, but I can't actually give them any of my personal stuff, because that's not like, now I'm doing this as a career.
Yeah.
And so that was a really strange time to like stop. Like I always ask them how they're doing when I see someone on the street, but like to not bum a cigarette or give a buck because they could be my client one day. It was like really strange. But like I realized like it would be really great to actually like work in the field. And I started working at the shelter as a staff member, and it was a really intense experience. It's a small shelter in Cambridge of 107 people, and mainly the same people night after night, but people can be actively using. And it was my first experience working with that population, being sober, which was totally new to me. And just really, if I didn't have as much recovery on my back, then it would have been pretty difficult to see that. I mean, like it's just, this is like you're working with people who are struggling to survive, and like, you know, you just see some horrific things, and you know, just a lot of sadness comes with this job. And I think if it wasn't for like my ability to like dissociate and like really like use some of my like stuff I learned as an addict, like, you know, it would be a really difficult job. And to also come into it with like no judgment was like huge, because a lot of people that work in human services, I think there's a lot of power struggle going on. And I think my director learned really quickly that I was more of an advocate rather than someone that was going to restrict someone for, you know, doing something that's against the rules in the shelter. So I quickly transitioned into working outreach and working with outside sleepers. One thing that I did really learn, though, that I think I play with a lot in my writing as well, was I, at that point in my recovery and in my life, just had a hard time with boundaries, and I just didn't have any. I didn't know how to make boundaries with people. And in working in human services and working this job, I really learned how to say no and how to put my foot down and how to create like lines between me and someone else, instead of just completely being immersed with that person and in their life. And that, I think, helped me in my writing of this book, and also helped me in just my career of just really keeping myself safe, because I had no idea at that point how to say no to someone, how to keep myself safe. And I learned that throughout my work with this population.
You know, I think that really comes across. Reading this collection, I thought of something Anton Chekhov once said to a friend of his as writing advice. His friend was writing, you know, these very kind of like emotionally difficult stories, and apparently it was kind of tearing him up to write them. So Chekhov's advice to him was, you need to be cold so that the readers can feel. And I feel like there's that distance is there. Like, this is incredibly emotional stuff, but there's a certain amount of detachment that allows me, like, as a reader, to just really be impacted by it. And at the same time, I feel like you never dip into sentimentality. It's never, you know, exploitative. It's just this really kind of matter of fact and honest view of your life and the lives that you encountered. Was that difficult to do? I mean, because these are real people that you must have been, you know, seeing all
Yeah.
the time.
I think that by using the form of the sonnet really helped in creating those drawing those lines and not being sentimental. I mean, at one point there was so many deaths, I couldn't just keep writing poem after poem of eulogies for these people. It was just too much, and especially for the reader, you know, like save that for just my own sake, to write it out just to get it out of my own head, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
But to create it and use form in such a way to create that distance and to create structure in something that's such a mess
Mhm.
of like, you know, this crazy world of people, I think really helped. And it was totally by accident that this was, I decided to use sonnets. It just kind of like my mentor that led the poetry workshop I was going to, Barbara Helfgott Hyatt. She, I like wrote one or two, and she's like, "Oh yeah, this could totally be a sonnet." I think I had like a rhyme in it or something, you know. And so I made it into a sonnet, and then I made two into a sonnet, and then I was just kind of stuck with the form of just like, all right, like I guess let's make a crown of sonnets. And then all of a sudden, like that last 15th sonnet, I was like, listen, I'm keeping with the same subject matter. I've already gone this far. I might as well make the actual 15th one and like make it into its own sonnet. So it was really also just, I feel like the pattern of everything interconnected is what
Yes.
this is, like me being connected to these people that I met, and then also like how this is like, it created kind of a world for me, you know, by using this structure.
I love the way, you know, just one leads into the other and just kind of reiterates the last line, sometimes slightly changing the word order, but that repetition just, it was almost cinematic, you know. I felt like one scene bringing me into another, and
Yeah.
these poems have, I mean, there was moments where you're attacked. There's moments where, you know, one moment that really stood out to me was when you're pricked with a dirty needle, and you squeeze your thumb. That, I mean, I say you because the narrator, you know,
Yeah.
carries your
Oh
name,
no, it's
and
me.
I know that these are your experiences, but I mean, that was just so visceral, and it must have been such a shock. I mean, how did you get through? How do you get through the day to day when there is so many deaths and there is personal danger that you live with?
I feel like being a poet um is how I get through this trauma of this job. If it wasn't for me being able to understand it and write it out and let it, like, let go of it and make some real things that happened that were really ugly into beauty, then I would just be living in an ugly world, and it would just be a really devastating job. And I say the truth, I think about, I don't know how some people like do this work without being creative and having an outlet. And I think, you know, just to take it all in and hold it inside, and just, it just probably isn't good for you, you know?
Yeah.
So I really feel like in order to work this job, like, definitely to have something like of an outlet really helps. Also, just being able to take something and make it into something else really showed me, like, what poetry is, even more so than before. Like in my last book, um
Which also fantastic and highly
awesome.
recommend. I'm gonna put all the links attached to
Cool.
the video so people can get their copies.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, no, in my last book, I feel like I hadn't come to that yet, like what I came to in this book, which is more like I was still like, I wasn't able to, I mean, I still transformed moments and made ugly things beautiful, but it was much more in this collection that I felt like as a poet I learned so much and was able to do that because I couldn't understand um like taking truth and taking some truth that happened and under like, sorry, I have to explain
No
this in some
problem.
sort of way for myself, but like taking some truth and trying to make it into a formal thing of like such a mess, it made it so I was able to cope with what had happened because I was able to take something that made no sense of like, how possibly could this happen to someone, how devastating is this, and really be able to make it into something that I can explain through imagery, through a moment in time where, for instance, like you said, when I got pricked by the needle, like I didn't know that that even really mattered, or I didn't even know that like I'd be so, all these moments just kind of showed up, and it's like just my reactions to them, and I didn't realize how strong I was until they happened. And then to try to understand how to cope with what happened, I could only write it out, and I can only explain it through writing. Like there's no way that I could have understood what was going on if I hadn't made it into poetry and revised it 500 times to really then understand. I learned so much about myself and about why I do the work I do. And just like I said, I think earlier, like I was trying to work with defining what home was at the same time I was helping these people. And you know, it's such a interesting thing in homelessness. I feel like the average person that doesn't really know a homeless person and just goes through life, they think, okay, like homeless, every homeless person wants a home. That's all. Everyone wants a home. And it's just not so black and white. And I feel like I got to understand what like just really like psychologically what it feels like to feel like, to what it is not to be homeless, but to feel what it is to want a home, and how actually that's really more difficult than, like, it's not so easy.
No.
And I really feel like I've been thinking a lot about that, and that's where I kind of realized that the Crown of Sonnets needed to be in the beginning. It used to be the second chapter of the book, and I put it as the first chapter because I realized this was all of what happened in this crown was really just, this is my reaction to it, whether it happened before or after. This is what got me to this, and that's why I moved the book around like multiple times to try to make it work, because I realized like everything was a reaction to that piece on my feelings in my personal life.
And you know, I feel like it, it's maybe the form sometimes has somehow allowed you to access very, you know, difficult to articulate things. And so maybe that in its most simple explanation, poetry, I guess, is that, right? I mean, it's you're
Yep.
using images and you're using language to convey the unarticulable, you know, you just kind of feel it. And although I've, you know, never experienced what these people have experienced or what you've experienced on a day-to-day, I feel like the closest I can get to knowing it is through this kind of expression. And that's such a difficult thing to do. You evoked Robert Frost at one point, at another point T.S. Eliot, in really interesting quotations that I think I would like to know a little bit more about your influences. I mean, maybe not influences so much, but how did their poems inform the writing process here?
Yeah. It's funny. Robert Frost, well, I realized that poem used to be way more about picking apples than it ended up being at the end. And that's why I was like, well, I can't just have a poem that doesn't mention Robert Frost that's about picking apples. That would be ridiculous. So I ended up um, adding him. And I always said, and I got it from the Outsiders, and it's funny. I used my little like sign off line is "Stay Gold,"
Yeah.
and I didn't. I had forgotten. I had been using it for so long, and I had forgotten that it ever even came from Robert Frost until someone mentioned it to me, like maybe like 10 years ago, and I was like, "Oh my God, I'm a terrible poet. How could I have forgotten?" I thought I was quoting like S.E. Hinton, you know. And so anyway, like I decided that this guy Robert Frost has had like such a remarkable thing. I started reading more of him, and then like once someone said, okay, well you need to include Robert Frost in your apple picking poem, and I did, and then all of a sudden the poem didn't really have that much to do with apple picking anymore. And so I was like, all right, I'll keep the quote of staying gold because I need to mention how nothing gold can stay
Yeah.
in that poem. So I also quote him in a poem that I wrote that's in the form of a guzzle about what home is.
Mhm.
And when I was working on that poem, it just so happened that this man Matt Sisson was in my poetry workshop, and he just spit out this quote by Robert Frost about home, and he was like, "Stick that in your poem," and that's how it ended up getting there. So it's usually like not. It's usually sometimes it's me that like gets there, but definitely like inspired by other poets telling me like, you made me think of this poet, and that's how I end up getting that poet. Like for instance, even with the T.S. Eliot, I needed the poem at one point was pages and pages long, and I was like, I can't have a 5-page poem about wallpaper and have anyone really keep themselves interested in it. So I ended up like saying, okay, I need something to like add to this. And usually to shake up a poem, I'll say, okay, like let me read the poem and think of like what language this reminds me of. And I think there was like one word. Um I think it was a description of the wallpaper, and it was a similar word that was in T.S. Eliot's Love Song for J. Alfred Prufrock. And then all of a sudden I was like, okay, let's read love song like 10 times and pick out words that I can use for my wallpaper language and stick them all throughout the poem. And that's what I did. And then I had quoted him at the top of that poem. And then I realized, I'm trying to remember the quote by heart and I can't, I might have to pick up the book. But then I realized 2 poems before said that quote sounded way better under the title. So I ended up moving it. And that's how I got that.
And it's beautiful. The cover again evokes the wallpaper and,
Yep.
and this beautiful kind of, floral pattern peeling to show, looks almost like a kind of graying plywood beneath it. And I loved that when I came to that poem and I connected it to the cover. I just thought, oh, that's fantastic. And that was one of my favorite poems. I think it was Boss's Daughter was the name of it. Yeah, that was just the weaving in and out of like all these different elements. Recovery is obviously one of the most important. And another moment that I just loved because I could relate to it in my own way was when your recovery world overlaps, when someone staying at the shelter that you knew from like a women's group or maybe a home group.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this fear about these kind of like two personalities meeting. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was, I love that poem and I love that moment in my life because I just had no idea what I would actually do. And then all of a sudden it happened. It's like I heard so many stories because a lot of people are in recovery that work in human services. So this is like a normal thing that happens, you know what I mean? And when it happened to me, I thought, oh, I'm going to save this lady. And my first reaction was like, you know way too much about me. What are you doing here? And scared the shit out of me.
Yeah.
And it was, again, like, I felt like if it wasn't for me free writing and making it into a sonnet and writing it out, I then learned so much about myself that I had no idea about, that I would, it's just so interesting how much you don't know yourself. And then through writing, you learn to understand yourself. Because, like I said, I had no idea that I felt those feelings. I thought, I'm here to save the world. Like, you know what I mean? And like I'm gonna get this woman out of this shelter. And then I realized my intention of getting her out of the shelter was totally a selfish intention. I just didn't want her to share anything about me. And it was just so interesting because I just never knew that about myself. And it's like you get into these insanely strange circumstances and you just had no idea who you were until that moment, you know? And I felt like that was a remarkable part, that I needed to write about and I needed to share out of the sonnets. I mean, it's so funny. I still write about my work because it's really therapeutic for me. But it was so interesting, like, to choose how each sonnet had to mean something else and tell the reader a different thing, and like transform in some different way, like, and how I was transformed by that experience. And yeah, I felt like I feel like throughout the book and even in the second part when I try to put I don't try, I make a homeless person into a poem and try to kind of screw with that metaphor that like this is what's helping me get through my own personal life. I feel like I learned so much about what language can do and what poetry can do, literally, like, in order for me to survive, in order for me to get through another day in my own life, I need to be able to articulate, to write it out, to revise it, to understand it, to be able to play that way. Mm-hmm. And I feel like by playing that way, I was able to, be able to exist in this world, be able to transcend myself, be able to create a home for myself. Yeah. By using language, And
the concept of home, it's the thread that it's not just the lack of a home, but the concept of home. That's something that you said at the beginning. It's not just that, a homeless person wants a home. That's their end all be all. It's more complicated than that. I think of, Thomas Wolfe. What was his famous quote? "You can't go home again."
Yep.
It's sort of a reality that we all deal with. It's just so vividly apparent when someone's sleeping under a bridge or on top
Yep.
of a steaming grate to keep warm. For in my life, I've backed up on that world, having been an addict. And a lot of, you go to a detox or you go to rehab or you end up, in jail, you're going to come across homeless communities. And many of them, their perspective was so different from mine. A lot of the times when I got busted or something, I ended up in a county lockup or something. My only thought was, get me the hell out of here. But then I would meet guys that were happy to be in there because it was, 3 hots and a cot, and their perspective was completely different. And not all of them were, they didn't fit at all the stereotype. I had a great friend. Well, I only knew him as Sunshine, but this was like a California train hopping kid who just sort of ended up in Texas and was in and out. Whenever, he was hard up, like really hard up, he knew he could just get a vagrancy charge and, get a place to sleep for a couple nights. And he was like beloved by the other inmates and the guards. And, I think that he did have a home and a family that he could have returned to, but the fact that he was literally preferred, spending a few nights in jail, I mean, that just goes to show that there's more at work here. There's more at play. And I feel like your work does a lot to dispel the myths that, all homeless people are just, I mean, it's a lot of different things. Of course, it's mental illness. Of course, it's addiction. But there's this kind of intangible truth that you seem to, touch with your poems that I don't know if it's ever really been articulated like this before. I mean, it's almost always like presented as a social problem and, or a redemption story. And your poems are not interested in either of those options.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like a lot of what I try to say is, I just want to take people to that world and to see what I see and feel what I feel, because it isn't just like you were saying, it's not like I was trying to make statements, but I wanted people. I learned so much in this work, and it helped me so much to live my life and create my life. And I wanted to kind of try to share that with people without an agenda. Like, it's like my writing never has an agenda. I don't know what I'm trying to say. The whole entire time I write is always trying to figure out what I'm trying to say. And I think that a good poet never goes into a poem knowing what they want to write. You figure it out as you write. And it's never fully known. You're just kind of, the reader's going through the journey with you of trying to work out, who the fuck am I? What the fuck am I doing here? And how do I survive this world?
Absolutely. I felt taken on a journey that by the time I reached the end of the book, and this poem I know has won some awards, but Map of Boston 2013. I mean, it knocked the wind out of my lungs. I've probably read it like 12 times by now. I've read it to my girlfriend. I've read it to my dad and my co-editors. To me, this poem, it takes something as massive and ugly as the Boston Marathon bombings and somehow ties it to, it's the unexpected, right? I mean, it's what we hear in workshop. It's what we hear, writing, we're always, whether it's fiction or poetry, we're reaching for the unexpected. And your poetry is full of the unexpected. I mean, it's full of images and turns of phrase that you've illuminated a little bit more of your process now. But did you ever find yourself surprised or almost thinking like, where did that come from? I mean, it's...
Oh yeah. And I mean, I think one trick of like that I've learned in my writing is that it's all about gluing things together that you just didn't even think. Like, if I say the word, like, not that I would ever say this word, but like snowy, right? Because I'm not really into adverbs or adjectives or whatever. But like, if I say that twice in 2 different poems, all of a sudden, that's one poem, and I'm going to put it as one poem, even if it has nothing to do with anything. I'm going to say, hey, there's some connection here, and put it together, because that's the fun of writing poetry. It's all about how much you can play. And that's what I like about form, because even though it seems like, oh my God, there's so much structure, what are you talking about? Play. And like, I feel like that's the poems where you have to pay so much attention to the language and be able to manipulate it to make it work in that form, that like it's really just trying to like I feel like that's the one of my favorite parts about the writing process, is really just being able to take anything and put it together and have it connect and somehow like relate to one another. And I feel like that's why like my language, like I surprise myself in my writing, because it's like, okay, yeah, of course, when I first look at like the two poems that's the word snowy's in, I'm like, are you kidding me? You know? And then like, but I like make myself do it, because that's what writers do. Like they do things that aren't that fun sometimes, but then it becomes fun once the process, you get over the initial shock of like, wait, are you serious? And then like you get to have so much fun just trying to make it work. And I feel like just to say, the new stuff I'm writing right now, I've been getting into, even I just learned about this new form I want to share about because I find it really interesting. It's called the golden shovel. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
It's like literally like 6 years old, made up by Terrence Hayes.
Oh.
And you take your favorite, well, not your favorite, you take a quote or you take a line from a song or a line from a poem, and it becomes the last word. So if the line is like, I chose a Janis Joplin song, Get It While You Can, right? So the end of the first line is get, the end of the second line is it, end of the third is while, so on and so
I
forth,
see.
till you get the whole entire quote as the last line of the poem. And then you probably title it something like, you know, I titled mine like something like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because that was the theme of the poem. And then you quote the Janis Joplin quote or whatever quote you choose. And then you kind of write in parentheses, if you want people to know, golden shovel. So then they know to look at the last words to see that you did it. So it's like, I've been obsessed with this new form because it's like you get to have so much fun, but also like you have this rule that you need to follow.
One thing that I feel like obstruction and form, it's just, it unlocks certain things, and I mean, how many times do you rewrite a poem, either a golden shovel or a sonnet, or if it's just a free write? Where does it go from maybe that first free write to what you could consider a finished product?
It's funny, I'd say most of the poems that I got in magazines totally weren't finished, like, when they got published. I think like even from when I got my book accepted to like when it actually got published, at that point the second chapter was the sonnets. I like totally flipped it and it was already accepted for publication. I feel like most of the time, I'd say at least 50 times you're revising a poem, and each time you're looking for something else, even if it's just changing a word as simple from this to that or to the.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's really important work because every word counts.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the fun of poetry, where you're just trying to find how to say something in the least amount of words as possible and have it transcend. I feel like it's funny, I've been working on a short story and everyone's like, you sound like such a poet. Everyone that's seen it, they're like, why do you take out all the I's and all the U's? And they're like, what's wrong with you? And it's just sort of like I feel like it's been interesting working with different kinds of writing, because I definitely would love to write a short story. And yeah, it can sound poetic and everything like that, but at the same time,
my favorite fiction writers all got started off as poets,
Yeah.
And you can just see it in the sentence structure, that attention to the language itself. is and poetry is a broad term. I've read novels that I thought could just as easily be called a long poem, and sometimes you use the form in a way like this is a very formal kind of work. The fact that they're sonnets, but they're not your usual sonnets, so you're very much willing to break the rules. But do you feel that having what was that?
I'll tell you something really
Yeah,
interesting.
of course.
Half the poems that were in the second chapter, I had taken a memoir class, right?
Yeah.
At Harvard Extension, my last semester, I had to fill up and take a couple of classes, which was great. They weren't offering poetry or anything. And so I took this memoir class. I didn't know what the hell I was going to write. So I ended up writing about some bad relationship that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got all those poems about like the poem as metaphor, or after I break up with the poem. Like those were all from just a breakup, and I had written it as a memoir. And it's like, I was never trying to write a memoir. That's not what I was trying to do at all. And I would bring it to class and everyone was so in love with it. And I was like, to me, it was crap. Like, you know what I mean? It was just totally not something I was trying to write. And then my teacher, Barbara, she was like, Alexis, just after the class, make it all into poems. And so I took like the 45 pages I had written, and that's how I got half my book.
Wow.
Just by it's funny, I've never actually, I haven't told that many people that, but not that it matters.
That's incredible. I mean, well, they have the indelible stamp of personal experience. So, I mean, yeah, I guess it's like a memoir in fragments, in poems. I mean, it's just, that's so interesting. I never would have ever guessed that. That's so cool.
Well, the thing is that also I think taking the thing about, well, for me, and of course people can write poems that go on about, a 5-year period of time, but I'm all about trying to stick with the moment.
Yeah.
Because the more I can say about a moment says so much about the 5 years.
Yes.
Who cares about 5 years? It all happened in 1 second, one time, and I try to get to that and find that, and that's where I try to write. So it's like when I wrote that whole memoir, there's 45 pages of a whole year relationship that I can tell I end up saying in maybe 8 poems in the whole entire book. And they're just 8 moments that I thought were ended up that were my best writing, that I said something heartbreaking, and that's what I decided would be the poem,
That's something that, I think even someone who writes a long novel, it comes down to distillation. Like maybe you're using more space for it, but that's I mean, it's a really tricky thing to find a moment that speaks volumes. And one poem that I think really did that for me is, I'm trying to find the name, but it's the one about the peeing of the bed,
Oh,
I just thought,
oh yeah.
What was it called? I Had to Pee. But it's just, there was something that was so relatable and heartbreaking about that. And it just kind of, I don't know. It was that, I think that's fairly early on. That might be in the first section, but I don't know. It cuts back. Again, the senses are so vivid, that evokes probably, the smell of beds in the homeless shelter, and the kind of the smell of the homeless in the most derogatory sense, but it kind of, I don't know, it brings it into your home, into kind of like a domestic space.
Well, it's also so interesting because the poems that I wrote about my family, which I had no idea that I was even, you can't stop writing about that shit. You're gonna write that the rest of your life, but when I wrote all the poems I wrote, it's I was just trying to understand why I chose this life of helping, of being an outreach worker. And this is what I came up with. And it was not like I was even thinking about homeless when I was writing these poems. It's of course, anything I write is why I became what I became, So I think that's what made me realize that it was all in response to the sonnets, and what made that all the second chapter, which was me just really trying to be wow, I don't have to think like, why do I feel connected to the homeless? I just am. So let me write about my life and it will just come out. And so that's what I started with. And then I honed all the poems into realizing, okay, this really said something, you know, and really then put it in the book of like, you know, something that works. Like I remember when, like, and I have a lot of poems that are actually, that didn't get stay in the book, that I now have, like, that I'm still working on now in this, the stuff I'm writing recently. But I remember in my first book, I was an addict and then I was sober, and that's all I wrote, you
Yeah.
know? And so that's what made it so easy when I was done with that book to put it aside, and all those poems made sense in that book.
Hmm.
In this book, I had a lot of different experiences happen, and I was writing and I was writing. And then at the end of this book, I had to actually say, well, what connects? And I had to choose which poems I was going to save for another book and which poems I actually made sense to put in here, which was a really fun experience putting a book together. Also, you learn like how, like, you know, in this book, in my first book, it was all about the chronological order. And in the second chapter, when I travel, you know, I traveled the country 3 or 4 times, but I could only be in Texas once, you know? And
Yeah.
so I like made it, when I was really in Mississippi, I gave it to Texas. And I had fun like changing where the hell I was to make it work for the book. And
Yeah.
I feel like in this book, I had more of an understanding of like bigger picture stuff, that I was like able to have a bunch of experiences and say, this has nothing to do with this focus on like what home is. And it was really fun to actually like think that way and to like move things around. And I ended up learning a lot about how it doesn't matter like the beginning to the end, how and that's the fun part about poetry. I feel like I mean, obviously as any sort of writer, you can move around the order of the way things happen, but to feel so fluid about it, it's really like, it really makes you build on like the kind of person you are, and how like, I don't know, in like a philosophical way, how life really is. And you're able to, like I said, just like be fluid like that as a person. Being a writer and being a person, like that's like part of your identity, but it also changes who you are by like how you write and like what happens in your writing. Like it's like totally, I mean, and I keep saying this, like the therapeutic value of writing. I constantly am doing my art in order to save my life every day. And that's why recovery, it is part of my recovery.
Hmm.
Not working with the homeless per se, but writing, whether it is about homelessness or not. I've learned a lot about how to stay sober and how to treat myself right by being a writer.
Absolutely. I think it's I mean, for me personally, it's the prime reason that I write. I remember my first sponsor was like, okay, I'm gonna have you kind of like keep a journal. And I was like, I'm one step ahead of you, bro. You know, I got it. But I mean, not having that out, a lot of people don't have that
Yeah.
outlet. And so maybe, you know, I felt like the reading of this, it reinforced a lot of stuff, and it brought me back to like my early recovery, because it was kind of one of those like, I was pretty fairly privileged drug addict, you know, but it was one of those like, there but for the grace of God go I, you know, like I was
Yeah.
at my worst not far away from, you know, and ended up like in some pretty rough spots. But I realize now that, you know, it kind of reinforces gratitude, and it also makes me think that, you know, we should all, you know, service work being one of the main tenets. This is like an amazing way to kind of feel your creative side, give back. I mean, it feels like, at the same time, how was it like? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about being that close to using again. In early recovery, I just don't know if I would have been able to handle that. Is
Uh,
it different now? Are you just able to kind of like compartmentalize being around that?
yeah. I mean, and I say it in my first book, and so I have 12 years of recovery, and I've been working this job for 5 years.
Mm.
And I'd say my fifth year of recovery, I was still being very self-destructive in a lot of ways. Like I said, a lot of those poems were about a bad relationship.
Yeah.
And I feel like um I feel like I it took me maybe 5, 6 years into being sober, into actually living a life that wasn't self-destructive. So it's like strange, like, I don't know if I said that right, but I mean, I could have never worked that job until after 2000, until I did,
Yeah.
until 2015, because I still wasn't living right. And I feel like it's interesting because when I first sobered up early in my recovery, my boyfriend at the time overdosed and died, and it made me very disgusted in the drug.
Yeah.
And I ended up really never wanting to use again for a while. And that was very, very early in my recovery. I was 6 months sober. And even though I was being self-destructive for the next 5 years in every other way I could,
Yeah.
like, that was my life. And then when I finally had some more devastating stuff happen, it was then that I actually started working. I called someone from a meeting and saying, "Hey, I don't want to live like this anymore.
Yeah.
Will you be my sponsor?" And I started working the steps in Narcotics Anonymous. And I'd say, like, maybe about a year later, year and a half later, I started working with active addicts and that are homeless, in this job. And I feel like if it wasn't for that year and a half of me, like, really trying to understand myself and really finally admitting, I think it wasn't until that moment
Yeah.
that I needed help and that I had a problem,
Yeah.
and that I was just, on my way to a relapse. And even if it took another 4 years, that was the point, from then on.
Oh yeah,
And
I mean,
so,
it's like
yeah,
they make you do the autopsy, and then the relapse autopsies. They've
yeah,
talked a lot about, and yeah, it could have been something from 2 years ago, but that's the moment. And I guess you kind of were at a fork in the road, and I'm trying not to quote Robert Frost and say anything about the one less traveled, but that's it's just such a encouraging and an amazing path that you chose, and I'm really I can't commend you enough for the writing of this book. It feels like really, really important work, and
yeah. And I do want to say it's such an interesting time with what's going on,
yes.
with the coronavirus and what's happening with the homeless, like we spoke about in the beginning.
Hmm.
um right now there are people that are getting put in hotel rooms and having this amazing experience of living luxuriously for a little while during this time. People that are homeless, that literally slept on a cot for 15, 20 years and now are sleeping in these luxurious beds in a hotel room,
Wow.
because that's what's going on. People need to be placed somewhere. um and it's just such an interesting time, um that I just want to say, like it's difficult, because even people who, and even though some of them aren't going to luxurious hotel rooms or whatever, but
Yeah.
at the same time, I think what's so strange is that people who are, like, going to the same shelter day after day now have to go to a new place to stay.
Yeah.
That it's so strange that they're becoming displaced again in a different way.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not trying to keep writing about it. I do think, like, maybe I could write an essay. I don't know, like, writing a few more poems. I don't know. I always feel like when I finish a book, it's like, okay, I'm done writing about this topic. I need to move on.
Right.
I've said what I've said, but obviously things keep changing in the world. So it's like, I don't control what I write about. So who knows. But I do find it interesting to be displaced again, and to be, like, without the shelter that you were feeling like was some sort of home. I just find it really interesting. It's a really intense time for people on the street right now, and it's so interesting because there's a lot of people that are pretty vulnerable to this because they
Sure.
don't have great immune systems, that are on the street. But it's been strange, like, at least for me, I haven't had many clients. It's been very asymptomatic in the community. Even people who have it aren't suffering from it yet. I mean, I'm in Boston, things are very crowded, things are kind of crazy.
Sure.
But it's just been such an interesting time for working in human services. And I feel like this like weird guilt because, I'm stuck at home, though I have every reason to be home to keep myself safe. But at the same time, it's just like I just didn't know that this is where I would be at this time. Just like life in general, I guess, But so it's been an interesting time. I've actually taken this time to kind of be on a writer's retreat, which has been awesome. But like I said, it's just I ended up writing about how I thought I would be an essential worker, and I'm stuck at home, and it's like, I guess those are the poems I'm writing now.
Well, I think that was actually something I was going to ask, because a lot of my writer friends, we've been talking about the first couple weeks, we just felt like we didn't know what to write, because it's like, what kind of world are we writing for, right? Like, what's it going to look like in 6 months, 1 year? I think the only thing we could agree on is that it'll be significantly different from the world we're used to. So how do you feel that informs like writing in this time with so much uncertainty and fear and division?
I think it's a great time to, I feel like, I don't know, it's so interesting because I hear from different people saying, oh, I don't even know what to say right now. And I feel like, well, isn't that the best time to write, when you have no idea what the hell is going on? Because that's when I get my best writing out, because I have no idea how I'm feeling or what to feel. And I'm going to let the language take me somewhere that I had no idea, and learn something about myself and learn how I feel through the act of generative writing. And I feel like that's been huge. Like I feel like there's a lot of writing about the virus that's really uninteresting. Yeah, we're all going through that. That's nothing new. Okay, so what? And I feel like, the things that I want to hear is not like the poem I came to was literally my out of office message at the homeless shelter. And I had a fake message that I made of why I can't come to work, is the poem I ended up writing. And it wasn't even like I had meant to write it. It was just sort of like, when I was doing some generative writing with friends, I kept on being so mad and beating myself up about why I couldn't go back to work. And that's kind of a lame poem. Like, that's not interesting at all. So I ended up like saying, okay, like what is interesting? And all of a sudden, like, I decided, let me make this into an out of office message and make it kind of like where I'm saying, like, to the world. I feel like, like I said, I had open heart surgery, and I've written about it, and I keep writing about it because obviously it's something that I don't really understand that happened to me when I was 2 weeks old. But I have a scar I carry around my whole life that tells a story that I wasn't there for, even though it happened to me. And I feel like it's affecting my life again, and it's never affected it so much as to now, to when I was 2 weeks old, because now I can't go about business as usual because of this. And I've had to share with people, this is why I can't go to work. And I just couldn't even believe that this is actually like what my life has become. Like, like, it's shocking to me. And I couldn't just you can't just say that to the reader. That's not like, so what? You know what I mean? Like, what am I really trying to say? And I think it's just like, how do I say my feelings in the right way and make it interesting? And it became that, like, I realized that I haven't had to tell so many people, not that I owed it to them at all to tell them about my heart operation, but that's what I ended up coming to, because I felt like just saying I can't work because I have this, it's like, never have I used language like this before, a heart condition. I used to just say I had a heart operation when I was born, when I was 2 weeks old. Like, that's how I explained it. But then I had to use professional language to say it. Like, I have a heart condition. I can't come to work because I'm high risk. And all of a sudden I'm using the language of the pandemic. And this language that's new to everyone, that everyone is just kind of like, now that's our new language, And I was like, let's use that language and make an out of office message, because messages are language, And that's how I ended up writing. Well, that's my first poem of the pandemic. I also have like made poems of like let's like, I actually made a golden shovel about the pandemic, where I like decide to like do dumb things in my house, like, decide which pieces of wood in my house are real and which aren't. like dumb shit like that. And like, I go around and I kind of think it's actually a little bit political. I end up thinking about prisoners, not that I feel like I'm a prisoner, but just like I end up thinking about like, here I am stuck in here, and what's my whole entire obsession with like death row, and like what's that all about, and so I like try to make that connection. I don't know if it works or not, but like, just like I don't even mean to, like I said, I've never meant to write what I end up writing. It just kind of happens. And I think that any writer needs to have that like openness, because anything that I've ever chosen to write is going to come out like crap. Like, in order for me to have written that golden shovel about Janis Joplin, I had a poem that just kind of sucked and it wasn't doing anything on the page. And I was like, let me make it into a form to make it matter. And that's how I usually make poems. That's how you end up writing the poem itself. You take something that's a little bit like not that great and say, I'm going to do something to this. And I could have made it into a golden shovel and then decided, hey, I'm going to take out the golden shovel and then have it just be it. But at least I transcended the poem. And I feel like that's like, as a writer, doing that is just so important in the revision process, to be able to just mess around,
take risks,
Yeah.
So to that end, and feel no pressure at all, though I am going to pressure you, would you be willing to read us a poem to kind of close off our interview? It can be any kind of poem you want. I am very curious about the out of office message.
Map of Boston, 2013. It used to be actually called From My Fire Escape up until like 10 minutes before they took the book. Map of Boston, 2013. From my fire escape, a blue balloon has strayed from its party, caught on a tree. It's out of breath, tired of the bullying wind. From up here, I can make out the other side of the playground, and a dandelion in the alley grows out of a crack. I didn't grow up well-mannered, no linen napkins on my lap, but on paper plates on Center Street, one of childhood's main drags. I've moved out of my folks' house, where the one leaf in my salad was iceberg, learned to lose my mother's Boston accent, learned how dirty half-melted snow can get. I could show you certain corners of Mattapan. Clotheslines keep high-rises from falling. Fights break out, windows stay broken, hate crimes caked in paint on storefronts. Even I was dangerous once, buying late summer smack, overheating the car on Blue Hill Ave. These days, it's murder on Boylston Street. It's pressure cookers tearing the marathon apart, blowing legs loose like bricks in the blizzard of '96. The Commonwealth is constantly in revision. Even I edit myself, take out every never, each always. I used to think explosions near the finish line meant victory.
Wow. Thank you so much. That
was really fun to read.
Oh my God. And it feels even more special to hear that that's the first time you've read that version out loud. I mean, that poem just, it is spectacular.
I was really happy when it got put on City Hall wall. That that just makes you feel really great when that kind of stuff happens.
Could you
And to
tell
be
me?
recognized that way.
Oh, and I feel like it's such a moving tribute to something that's still difficult to talk about in any manner. Maybe the only way to properly talk about something like that is through poetry. How did that come about?
That poem.
Well, yeah.
Um,
I mean, we're just the background to it, and I don't know, I don't want to
yeah.
feel like it's giving anything away, but
Yeah,
I'm
no, I
just so
mean, to
curious.
tell you the truth, like I said, I think that was a glue job of like 4 different poems. Like, I wrote about just from my fire escape what I saw. And actually that blue balloon wasn't even from my fire escape, it was from someone else's. You know what I mean? And I took a lot of different things about like I was writing, I think, just about how I felt about Boston, and there was way too much. Like, if you only were living in Boston, like, you would know what I was talking about, and I had to take all that out.
Yeah.
And then I did write a lot about the marathon, and I just took what was interesting from what I wrote about the marathon and got to the end. And I think that that image of like I try to get really to the point of language at the end of that poem where like explosions also could be a positive thing.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that whole idea of celebration versus like total traumatic, like war zone
Yeah.
is just, it's all the same language, just used in a positive way and used in a negative way. And I was totally blown away by that. And like, that's how I got to writing at the end, where it's like I even revised myself. Every city is Boston. Every city is always in revision. Every city always has this grittiness, always has this beauty, and it's like, it was funny throughout writing this poem. Like, for instance, in the line, and it's funny when I was reading it because it was the first time I had made the change in the last version. From up here, I can make out the other side of the playground. It used to be from here, I can't make out the other side of the playground. And so it was so funny when I was reading it, I was like, wow, I played with this so much because that's the thing, that language,
Yeah.
like the positive to the negative, what you can and what you can't see. If I can't make out the other side of the playground, but I can make out one side of the playground. And so I just pushed that idea of like how everything is what it isn't, throughout the poem is how I got to the poem. And even just what I say about my parents, I went on and on saying how I eat spinach now, like who gives a shit? You know what I mean? And it's like in the end, I think that was like literally I took that out like last minute. Like, there's just so much I took out because it was like, what am I trying to say? I was still trying to figure out what I was trying to say, even in the last version, where I was like, I don't need to mention that I eat spinach. Like, iceberg's a way more powerful word if you ask me. Like,
Absolutely. That I feel like this is such great advice for writers at any level, because it is, I mean, it's a process. There's I think this myth that most people who don't write have, this myth that you sit down and you bang it out. You have like
Yep.
these emotions, and all it is a matter of getting them on the page. And it's really so interesting to hear the background to just how a lot of these poems are put together. How my writing mentor, he called his novel, he said he Frankensteined it together. And I always said, first of all, I just love that word,
As a verb, yeah.
Frankenstein. But it's true. I mean, that's what we do. Sometimes we have a piece that works, but not where it is, and you just need to be willing to move stuff around painstakingly, and you could end up with something as incredible as
I mean, I do want to say, like, from what you said, and something that I truly believe in is that if I want to write a poem about something, I'll write that poem, but I can't go into it knowing everything. I have to go into it not knowing some things.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point, that you figure it out. Like you were saying, the process is to figure out some things. You can't go into something, I want to write about my dead grandmother. Like, that poem's gonna suck. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, no matter what. And like, And like, yeah, one day you'll get to your dead grandmother, like, you know, but you can't go into it saying, this is what I want to write, you know? And I feel like anything that and same with form. You can never go into writing a form saying, I'm going to write a sonnet and plan to write a sonnet and write it at the sonnet as you're writing it. It would just be crap, you know? Like, you need, like, what I like about form and what I like about writing is it tells you what to do. You know, like, if it wasn't for, you know, that first poem I brought in that ended up having a rhymed couplet at the end, like, I would have never written a crown of sonnets. It just so happened, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that like, or if you have a poem where you repeat a lot of words, it's like, okay, well, and it's really long. Maybe it's in the form of a sestina, and that's what I need to make this poem into. Because you can never choose, I'm going to write a sestina. Because sestina is never going to sound good, you know? And I think that that's, by writing in form, and so many people are afraid to write in form, it's going to make you a better writer, and it makes you pay closer attention to the language and to the words, which is what poetry is in the first place. So I usually recommend, like, everyone play with form, as scared as you are about it, because like I said, and half the time it doesn't even choose you. It would be ridiculous if someone wrote a 14-line poem with a rhyme couplet and not tried to make it a sonnet, you know, which people are doing with this American sonnet thing, but whatever. But like, it's the point that it's like, you know, you can't like, you have to be able to let the writing tell you something. You can't just inform the writing. The writing needs to inform you.
Alexis, I am so grateful for you taking the time to talk to us about your work, about your life. This has just been such a privilege.
Yeah, it's been great catching up, man.
Yeah, we got to do this again. Just, you know,
yeah, definitely.
Have a little Zoom party, because that's the only kind of parties we can have these days.